There was a samurai once. His name was Takeo. He wasn't born broken. He wasn't born angry or lost. No, he started the same as anyone. A child with wonder in his eyes, always asking questions, dreaming of becoming a great warrior. But the world of Bushido, the samurai code, it didn't care about that boy. Not in the way he needed. His father was a samurai before him, strict, cold, full of expectations that felt like boulders on Takeo's chest. Every morning training, every mistake punishment, not physical always, though that came too. The worst punishment was the silence, the disappointed look, the shame that followed him like a shadow. Today we're diving into something dark, something most people don't know about samurai culture. The brutal past behind warriors who lost their minds, not from battle, not from physical wounds, from something much deeper. From the psychological torture of living under Bushido, a code so rigid that breaking it meant you were better off dead. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why some of the most disciplined warriors in history couldn't handle the weight of their own honor. Before I show you exactly how this happened, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and tell me in the comments. Have you ever felt crushed by expectations you couldn't meet? This helps the channel grow. Thank you for your attention. Now back to the video. Let me tell you what happened to Takeo. He grew up training every single day. Sword technique, strategy, meditation, honor, duty, loyalty. These weren't just concepts, they were laws. Break one and you weren't just a failure. You were nothing, worse than nothing. You were a stain on your family's name for generations. Takeo's father would tell him, a samurai who loses his honor is already dead. He just hasn't had the courage to make it official yet. Those words embedded themselves in Takeo's nervous system. They became the voice in his head. They rewired how he saw himself, others, and the world. At 16, Takeo was sent to serve a lord. An honor, his father said, but what Takeo experienced wasn't honor, it was psychological warfare. Every day he watched other samurai. Perfect posture, perfect discipline, perfect composure. No one showed weakness, no one showed fear, no one showed doubt. And Takeo had all three churning inside him constantly. He learned to hide them. He became a master at it, charming when needed, silent when required. He could read what people expected and shapeshift into that person. But underneath he was empty, hollow, like a temple abandoned after fire. Walls still standing but the soul gone. Bushido emphasized loyalty, honor, and the ultimate sacrifice for one's lord. To die in battle was to fulfill one's duty, to surrender was to live in shame. This wasn't just philosophy. This was the air samurai breathed every single day. And for someone like Takeo, who felt things deeply, who questioned things quietly, this code became poison. Because here's what no one tells you about unprocessed trauma in samurai culture. It didn't just sit in memory, it embedded in the body. It warped the nervous system. It taught a warrior that they were not safe, not worthy, not real. That their value existed only in perfect execution of duty. One mistake and everything collapsed. Takeo was 23 when it started. The insomnia. The feeling that something was always wrong even when everything seemed fine. Then came the paranoia. The rage he couldn't explain. The self-hatred that felt like a beast living in his chest. He couldn't trust anyone, not even himself. One night he was assigned to guard duty. Simple task, stand watch, stay alert. But his mind wouldn't stop, thoughts racing. Memories of his father's disappointed face. Fear of failing, fear of being exposed as weak. Fear of the shame that would destroy his family. 4 hours into his watch, another samurai found him sitting on the ground, staring at nothing, talking to himself. Not random thoughts, arguments, full conversations with people who weren't there. The other samurai reported it. Takeo was brought before his lord. The lord asked him one question, "Can you still serve with honor?" Takeo wanted to say yes, but the word stuck in his throat because he didn't know anymore. He didn't know if he was a samurai or just someone pretending to be one. The silence was his answer. The lord nodded. "You have 3 days." Takeo understood. 3 days to restore his honor through seppuku. Ritual suicide by disembowelment. Seppuku was not only a method of death, but also a psychological burden carried by characters, the mental anguish that accompanies the rigid expectations of honor. This was the samurai way. When you couldn't maintain the performance anymore, when the mask cracked, there was only one honorable option: death. But here's what modern psychology reveals about this system. In the POW camps, the psychological scars of these soldiers were evident. Many suffered from intense guilt and depression. their mental anguish exacerbated by the harsh conditions and the stigma attached to their captivity. The samurai code didn't just demand perfection, it made imperfection a fate worse than death. It created what psychologists today call a false self, the version of you created to survive, not to live, not to thrive, just to survive. This false self wears masks. It tells people what they want to hear. It buries the truth so deep that even you forget it's there. But that truth doesn't forget you. Takeo spent 2 of his 3 days alone, not preparing to die, trying to understand what happened to him. He wrote in a journal, chaotic pages, some sentences repeated 50 times. I did everything right, why wasn't it enough? He realized something that would have been called heresy in samurai culture. The code itself was what broke him, not his weakness. The code, because Bushido demanded something impossible. It demanded that human beings stop being human. That warriors never feel fear, never feel doubt, never feel pain. That they transform themselves into living weapons. And Takeo couldn't do it, not because he was weak, because he was still human underneath the armor. Carl Jung, the psychologist, said something centuries later that Takeo would have understood. The greatest tragedy of the family is the unlived lives of the parents. Takeo inherited his father's trauma, the suppression, the silence, the cold legacy of emotional neglect dressed up as discipline. His father had been crushed by the code, and instead of breaking the cycle, he passed it to his son. That's what unprocessed trauma does. It doesn't die with you, it multiplies. It becomes a ghost that haunts the next generation. On the 3rd day, Takeo dressed in white, the color of death, he knelt in the designated place. A kaishakunin stood behind him, another samurai whose job was to decapitate Takeo immediately after he cut his belly, to shorten the suffering, to preserve the dignity of the act. Takeo picked up the tanto, short blade. He placed it against his abdomen, and then something happened that shocked everyone present. He put the blade down, he looked at his lord, and he said, I cannot do this, not because I am afraid of pain, but because I finally understand. This code that demands I die rather than heal, it's the sickness. Not me. The room went silent. What Takeo had just said was unthinkable. To question Bushido itself was to reject everything samurai culture stood for. The Lord stared at him, then did something no one expected. He dismissed everyone except Takeo. When they were alone, the Lord spoke quietly. I should order your execution for what you just said, but I won't. Because 30 years ago I was you. I was kneeling where you're kneeling, about to cut my belly. And I couldn't do it either, not from cowardice, from clarity. I realized that a code demanding my death for being human was a code I could no longer serve. The Lord explained, I left, I gave up my title, I wandered for years. I studied with monks. I learned that strength isn't suppression, it's integration, it's facing your darkness without letting it consume you. Then I returned, not as the warrior I was taught to be, as the man I actually am. And paradoxically, that made me more effective, more respected, more whole. He looked at Takeo, you have a choice, die for a code that broke you, or live and learn what it means to be a warrior who doesn't sacrifice his humanity for honor. Takeo chose to live. He left that night. He wandered Japan for 5 years, alone, processing everything. He stayed in temples. He learned Zazen meditation. He wrote, he cried, he raged, he grieved for the boy he'd been, for the years he'd lost pretending to be someone he wasn't. And slowly something shifted. The voice of his father, the voice of Bushido, it grew quieter. Not because he suppressed it, because he finally questioned it. He asked, why should my worth depend on never making mistakes? Why should my humanity be a weakness? Why should death be preferable to healing? Modern psychology calls this individuation. The process Carl Jung described of becoming whole by facing the dark, chaotic parts of yourself. But for someone like Takeo, it didn't feel noble. It felt like drowning, like being pulled into depths of something ancient and terrifying. Despite the removal of cultural sanctioning, the rate of suicide in Japan remains high, with suicide masquerading as seppuku still carried out both there and abroad. The legacy of Bushido still haunts, because that code taught generations of men that their pain didn't matter, that their trauma should be buried, that weakness of any kind meant death. Takeo returned after 5 years, not to his lord, to his father. His father was old now, sick. When he saw Takeo, he wept, not from joy, from shame. I broke you, he said. The way my father broke me, the way his father broke him. Takeo knelt beside him. You didn't break me. The code broke both of us, but I'm not broken anymore. His father looked at him with confusion. How did you survive? Takeo replied, I stopped trying to survive. I started trying to heal. I looked at everything I'd buried. The fear, the shame, the rage, and I let myself feel it, without judgment, without the need to fix it, just feel it. Here's what Takeo learned, what any warrior crushed by impossible expectations learns if they survive long enough. Healing doesn't begin with motivation or positive thinking. It begins with honesty, and honesty begins in pain. You have to look at the truth you've been running from, the truth that you were hurt, that you weren't given what you needed, that the expectations placed on you were impossible, and that none of that was your fault. Japan sadly has one of the highest suicide rates in the world. There still exists an ingrained culture of shame targeting those who fail to meet family or community expectations. The code lives on, but awareness is growing. People are beginning to question. If you've ever felt like you're going crazy, if the weight of expectations feels like it's crushing you, if you've spent your whole life performing and don't know who you are underneath, know this. You're not broken, you're buried, under trauma, under expectations, under a code that demands perfection. And healing isn't becoming someone new. It's remembering who you were before the pain taught you to forget. How do you begin? Start with silence, not the numb silence of disconnection. The sacred silence of listening. Write, scream if you need to, walk, cry, but do it consciously, without shame. Because madness isn't the enemy, it's a message. A cry from the parts of yourself that have been locked away. Takeo lived to be 58. He never returned to samurai service. Instead, he taught, not sword technique, how to recognize when the code you're following is killing you, how to honor discipline without sacrificing humanity, how to be strong without suppressing everything real. He would tell his students, the warrior who survives isn't the one who never breaks. It's the one who breaks and then learns to put themselves back together, not the way others demand, the way they actually are. If this video made you see something in yourself, something you've been hiding, I invite you to subscribe, like, and share it. Because the world doesn't need more people wearing masks. It needs more people who survived their shadow and came back with truth. Until next time, face your darkness, honor your humanity, and walk the path.